Very happy that you're all here. So we have, I think, a few English-speaking people in the crowd, so I hope it's not a problem that we do this short session in English. If there's anybody who has difficulty with that, just let me know, then I'll try to translate a little bit in between as well. Again, very happy that you're here. We have opened the exhibition on Mass Support already a few weeks unofficially, more or less. But today is really the event that we're kind of celebrating and trying to get to know a little bit more about the ideas behind it. And we're very happy to have so many of you here who I think have worked at the SAR, who've worked in that framework and maybe can tell a little bit more about it. Quickly to say that it's an exhibition of CASA. In cooperation with CRC, which is the group that I am part of and is led by Sergio, who's sitting here, who's responsible for a large part of the exhibition. And each year as a group, we usually focus on making a project together with the group and focus on one of the PhD subjects of one of our colleagues. And our colleague Kasim Shepard from New York, he is actually doing his PhD partly on the ideas of the SAR. So he got us really interested in this, and then of course John Haber, who worked here for a long time, and I think it's now 55 years ago. So there were several reasons why we thought it would be interesting to make this exhibition. Vincent and Andrea were sitting there. They did lots of research at the New Institute to go through all these archives, which I think led to a beautiful exhibition, which you've seen. I'd like to ask Frans and Thijs maybe to come up to the, not really stage, but more of a lower ground here, to maybe ask a few questions. We just have one microphone, so I'll be passing along a little bit. Thijs, you're also very well known here, I think, in Eindhoven, because you were a professor here, if I'm correct.
Yes, that's quite right. Yes.
Can you tell a little bit of how you got involved with SAR, with the ideas of the SAR at the time, and what was it that intrigued you about it, that you thought maybe I want to be a part of this?
Yes. An honest question. Yes, I started at the SAR because I made in my study in Werf a project directed on what was called at that time industrial building. Housing, of course, was the main subject in that time, and to solve the problems regarding that on the industrial way, so to involve production and industry, and that was a quite normal thing to do. So in that time, I read the book on John. He published it in 1961 or something like that. I didn't know I was already interested in the subject in that time, but in 1963, I think I read the book. And in 1965, I made my final project. And immediately afterwards, I thought, this is the moment to finish my study on a more real theoretical way by visiting John Haber. So the SAR office was started in that time, about for a year. There was a famous conference in London. People who are interested in it can read the book Housing for the Millions. I never understood the book. The title of the book completely, because there was only a music program in that time. Music for the Millions. It had some reference to with that or not, but nevertheless I didn't understand it quite well. But it is a very readable book. I read it again because of this meeting, because perhaps someone is asking questions about that time, so I have to fresh up my mind in this aspect. So it is a pity that Dorine van Hoogstraten is not here, because he was one of the writers. There's one of people who helped that, Mariette Heijmans. He was at Planting and Heijmans. He was at that time worked at the book even. So it is a interesting. Perhaps I can fill in something.
And can you tell a little bit about the ideology of that time frame, of that time? Was there a kind of larger idea of people wanting to kind of open up the idea of housing, to involve participation by inhabitants? Can you tell a little bit about
Yes,
that?
that's so, indeed that was the reason to do that, because housing at that time was more specifically seen as a technological problem and not as a social problem. And I think, and certainly not as, and also not as an economic problem. And I think this was an interesting thing, because at that time we had Paul Hendricks, who established the share building economics. And in my final project, I used his support to interest me and to fill things in related to economic things. And the idea that for economic problems you have to have a market, and that in a market you have two sides, that the consumer and the producer, that it's not possible to direct all your efforts on the production side and not paying attention to the consumer side, in this case, the dwellers, etc. No.
So the idea of the market was already from a very early stage important to involve that in the design process.
Yes, I don't want to say that it was said with so many words, because we were working in architectural environments, and words like technology, production, even theory, etc., were words you in fact had to avoid. You had to do that on a practical, artistical way, and you had to convince people by making beautiful projects. And then, so the idea of economics and production certainly, because in the book the support and the people, then you can read that John made it very clear that there was a misunderstanding about the possibilities of technology, because it was used in the wrong way, and that you have to do that in a more correct way, and that was direct your efforts in the direction of the dwellers. Now, I don't have to discuss these things. We can go more in depth than necessary, but I also was interested in the theory of architecture, and that was in fact a problem, because I started my study as an architect on what is called an HTS, a vocational study, which is a very practical study, and then you were supposed to go to become an architect on two ways. There was a separate study, 4 years even after the regular 4 years of vocational study, and the other possibility was going to Delft. And often was not possible at that very moment. And I certainly had the idea that because there was no theory at all at the vocational study, I expected to find that in Delft, but nevertheless it was more or less a disappointment, but there was no theory at all. All the professors were doing their job. They had their office. You could do a project with them. You learn design quite well, I must say. You have to pay a lot of effort in this respect. But there was nothing that was directed on theory. Not at all. This John, in fact, was the first man who wrote the book. There was nobody in the faculty who had written a book. He was a special person who writing the book. Reading the book was already quite something, and even without pictures. The dragen zetten mensen was a book without pictures. Dus voor architects that was quite the thing to do.
And what was so appealing in this theory then for you?
What was
so appealing for you in this theory? What were the things that you thought, yeah, this is new, this is what I want to work on, which is what the research more?
Yeah, that always is a question for me. Still, this more or less a question. I was triggered by the notion of what John called in the book natural relation. Yeah? He said there is a natural relation between man and environment. What is the same type of relation between man and even between things in an environment? But that is already much more theoretical than the book went. But afterwards, it became filled in because we had to make quite an effort to make a connection with all the fields of theory and all the fields of philosophy, like the work of, let's say, Foucault, Heidegger, and not to forget Arendt, because also Arendt and Heidegger at that time were very much involved about the massification of society. And that was exactly the point that John was aiming his arrows at. And I also said that was the idea we had to work on. Because in that time there were only two strategies. The only first strategy was accept massification and try to get rid of all the negative consequences of that. And the other was to find the real gist of how to fight against this problem of massification. And this was found in the idea of what he called the natural relation, which is in fact a very complex notion, and it took me for at least, I think, 20 years to really understand that, because all modern philosophy is in fact involved something in the work in that theme.
And was this for the university quite strange and different than what their day-to-day practice was, or was it welcomed very much by the university as a great addition to the normal curriculum?
The faculty of architecture was not so very much interested in theory and theoretical notions.
So it was like a separate unit?
No, that was more or less a reflection of what was going on in society. And also Dorine from Hoogstraten, she wrote in the book, why didn't the architect not support the foundation architects more? It could be expected from them, but they were very bad leaders. Because they didn't have any notion, of course, about the idea of subwards and info, but they did not really have a deep understanding of what was going on. Because they couldn't work with it. It was difficult. And that's still the problem, because the philosophical notions behind that, in that natural relation, that you can give it any other name, it is in fact very difficult hierarchical semiotic concept that goes very far to work that out. And it was certainly not the idea to do that. But the only place where we could do that, get that notion make more transparent and visible, was in fact this very faculty of architecture. Because the visions of within this faculty, in fact, were the same, which also answered that notion of the natural relation. There was what they called a threefold distinction, and things like use, construction, and technique, as we called it in that time, which we could talk about, but also in the way articulations are made, levels, notion of phases, and the notion of sorts of categories, all would make parts of that theoretical concept. And the faculty, in fact, on a more or less intuitive way, I must say, worked out that principle very well. And so that means that we were the only faculty, or not only in the Netherlands, but also in Europe, where the notion of technology was incorporated in the faculty of architecture. Just building production and building execution, just building technique more in general, as in working out of methods and theory, make parts of the concept of the faculty, and could help it to survive in a situation of a university of technology. that worked out quite well up till 5 years ago. They had the idea in the faculty all the faculty, the chairs of technology, production technology, and execution technology, construction technology, which made in fact the very difference with the Delft University, and that was also the reason why there was a faculty of architecture in Eindhoven with a different signature. In fact, this part of the faculty was deleted, and from a purely theoretical point of view, in fact, it is not a faculty anymore, because there always has to be in the faculty a part which is responsible for the realization of things which are sought out. And so that's perhaps already a start for to get an idea about what is get us busy in that.
Sorry? Let's go to you. I'm curious, how did you get involved with SARS, and what was it that triggered you to work?
It was in the same year, 65, that I finished school in Delft. There was Job Bakema as my teacher, and Van Eesteren. And I wanted to make housing within a linear city, and namely. And Bakema kept me completely free and said, just go on and make your ideas. And so finally, designing the housing, I said to him, I cannot design layouts of dwellings, what is normally the practice in Holland to make mass housing. You design a dwelling, some dwelling types, and then you repeat them and you repeat them.
Why you couldn't?
And I didn't like that because there are no users involved. That's simple. So how could I design something without the response of a user?
You mentioned this to your teachers?
And I told that to Bakema, and he said, just take some examples and then we see later on. So I finished school, and it was amazing. Normally I got cum laude for just the ideas, I think. Not so much because of the design. But I made a kind of structure open to parcellate and to make infill with people. And then after that, Bakema said that, do you know about SAR? I said, no, I don't know it. John Habraken. So I went to John Habraken in Leidschendam, and I presented my project. And John said, well, that's just what we think about a drager, a support structure, what you are making. Or it's just growing like a young student.
You did not know the book at that time?
No, I didn't know it. I didn't know it about a SAR, and just and he said immediately to me, if you want to work with me, just you are welcome. And I had some program to work in a new town, in Avery in France. But in France also I met people who were working on habitat évolutif, so the same spirit. And after 5 years, John said, well, now I start a new program, how to design urban tissues. So I started in the 70s to work with John Habraken. But I was just involved because we had just the same basic ideas about structure and info.
And what did the work entail? What type of projects were you working on? Was this purely theoretical? Was it?
For my diploma work, yes,
Yes.
it was theoretical. And the end of the 5 years in France, I made a proposition for a competition in Patenrecht, and I had the first prize. So I was welcome there, and after some time I translated the SAR ideas of support and infill in my proposition of that competition, and I presented them to John Habraken with a model, and he said, how do you do that with the users? I think I don't know. I think I cannot make a books and variations and sub-variations. The SAR, they were working on kind of working out a method how to deal with the users. It's like users could choose different solutions. And I think when we are really focused on the social housing, whether it's the mass housing where support and build should be a real answer to them, then you have people who have no education and they are not involved and not working on it, and they don't design, of course. So I will be the designer for the people, and so I think I do like my father. He said, "How do your father is? He's a medical doctor." So if a private session is a patient, and so I see the client going in.
And
And
for
so-
Papendrecht, you then
And
did
in
that?
Papendrecht, I had the chance to start it, and it was amazing. It was amazing. It was just 2 times 1 hour with each of the users, and they made really the sketches, and then they had some time to think about it, and then they came back and we made the finishings, and they said, okay, let's do it like that. For people there who are coming from rent housing, social for housing corporation dwelling, they were just very glad that they could have their, not choose, but have influence, how to live, how to cook, how to receive people, what their hobbies were. And it was, in fact, it was not difficult. The only thing to learn for myself was to open the mind, to have no ideas what is a good way of housing, a good way of an infill, a layout. I have no ideas, so we come in and we make the job together.
How did it change you as an architect? Did you become more and more abstract in the sense of that you left much more to the user over time?
I had 7 times chance to be an architect for a support structure, and with the participation of the users, it's about 1,200 dwellings, it's a lot. And I found out that more and more we could make the infill more simple, and also the support structure more and more simple, just to focus on the really questions of what people like. And in the beginning we were very sophisticated, with plinths everywhere and all kinds of solutions and technical solutions. But at the end, it started in the 90s, and so we found out that the support structure could be very simple and focused on, for instance, where a window is, the light comes in the day, so people use the light in the day, but in the evening it's closed, so they need an artificial light on that point. So most points of lighting make fixed in the ceiling already, where you know the windows and the doors. So that's kind of strange, made it very simple. Another example what we discovered was when you have floor heating the support structure, and you have different zones, as you know, in the theory of alpha zones near the facades and the beta zones in the dark parts of the dwelling. They have different heating, they need different heatings. And because the cold comes from the facades, so the zones you can already know, and then it's not necessary to make heating like an infinite question anymore. So this kind of thing.
It sounds like a very time-consuming process, of course.
Yeah.
Was there pressure from clients to shorten this and not have so many talks and just get it on?
You know, in social housing, when the clients become involved, normally they have a chance to choose a dwelling when it's finished. In our process, it was necessary to know the users at the beginning of the construction in the field. And that was very nice, because then they know it's not a theoretical thing anymore because we start to build and now I can start participation. That also was very interesting. And then the users stimulate all the other people and the experts and the builder and so on, and the designer too, to make their job as fast as possible.
So
And
in
the
end,
users
yeah.
are involved also as a group. That's interesting.
Maybe curious to hear if there's anybody in the room that has any questions. Serge?
Maybe for Frans. How do you deal with the second generation of inhabitants? Because the first one gets to choose everything, but then, if I understand also from the Housing for the Millions, a big issue with the SAR was that industry did not really develop all the infill packages that the SAR expected that they would be developed. Which means that in the end, the inhabitants could not change easily their homes, correct?
Yes, there's a movie about a film of the Motorhead project. And at one moment I explained in that movie with the users that we thought even when the infill could not change afterwards, it's already very nice that you have identification of your home in the beginning. That's like all cities have, and if you change, it's a problem. But in fact, even the very simple and not very good infill system that we had at that moment allowed to change afterwards. And for instance, in Utrecht, the infill system was from Brownsville and was really focused on change afterwards. So when a new family comes in, there's always the possibility to discuss if you change something. But also during some families that live in, children go out, the parents want to use the space in a different way, and that was practiced. Or they want to have a new kitchen, for instance, and make it larger or smaller, etc. Yeah. But it's slowly going. This is nothing that you do every year or every 5 years even. So it's more a rhythm of 20, 25 years that the infill has to be changed. And it's very nice because infill materials after 20, 25 years, you need to break down, partly to be changed also.
And then the process would repeat again? Would you have then lengthy discussions with these new families?
That depends on the housing corporation. And in the practice, I think the project that I had were rather complicated for the housing corporation. Not complicated, but very new. You had to get used to the idea, to accept even that people have strange ideas in their lives. It's not normal to have a dwelling without any rooms. It did happen also. So one of the questions I told also to Kyle was always, we think that it is a technical problem. It's always a human problem. Even for the organizers, for the local government, etc. And once you know what you want, and the goal is very clear, give the users the right of decision, then answers and technology are coming along, and developing itself also. But in our project, we started with little possibilities.
More questions? Anybody? One more from Sarah.
I'll keep going as long as you're giving up. How much influence was there on the SAR from other international examples of similar conditions? You know, of separating, not supports and infills, but having two speeds for architecture that it becomes more dynamic. Was
I was just a practical, simple architect. So I was just focused on my own jobs, more or less. And
would you know about that, guys?
And after some years, we presented our project. And the reason of that was that People know about the theory, people read the books, and we like it, and they say, well, we should go and do that. But the steps to make it real and to go in the process is quite another thing. So in France, they were very interested. I did many workshops there, young people also, and now I'm very happy that, for instance, here and in Delft, there's a new wave coming up of interest of user participation, and not only in the dwelling, but how to organize participation on a larger scale, of a neighborhood, of a city district, how to organize participation on that scale.
Why was this lost for some time?
Yeah.
Do you have an idea why this was a certain moment when the idea died out and there was maybe no more interest? And you
Oh,
say
yes.
there's now a new wave?
I'm sure. I wrote a book, and one of the chapters of my book is why supports are not built so much. What's difficult? And I found out, first of all, the clients of the housing corporations, I didn't work for developers. Developers are not interested in long term, so they are not interested in reparcellation of the structure. So they do the job and they go away. The housing corporations, they are really interested in long term. They want to keep the value of housing, their property. What was your question?
Why do you think it at a certain moment
Oh, yeah.
died out
Yes.
and now you see
Well, the housing corporations are afraid. In fact, the whole answer is there is fear always. Fear to change, fear to listen to the users, to give the users a chance. Oh, it will be strange dwelling now, and how can I do it for the next one? This is always fear. Always fear. So we're not trusting possibilities. And then the architects, they like to decide on everything. So also, and I don't decide on it because I don't know the client. So that's that whole rethinking of the habitats, the way of doing. That's the main message of the SAR from the beginning. And I understand it is difficult for people. Difficult because they are not used to it. Also, for instance, the regulations don't allow. In the beginning, we couldn't do the SAR project because the regulation says one bedroom for parents should be 11 square meters plus cupboard. And so, because it has to be cheap, all the parents' bedrooms are 11 square meters. It's completely stupid. And you have had this participation with the users. They were using the bedroom is the master room of the house. Large things and big. And it was, and the other one, we said, we're very small for us, it's enough. Children are very important.
Yes, I think it's perhaps important on this very moment, now we are dwelling on participation and developed participation, that after 5-10 years, I think, this notion of participation became a wider and wider notion. And we saw that there were more people than only dwellers who were involved in the building process. And there were, beside architects, also constructors and producers and developers and people like that. So that you have to make some notion of this notion of participation much wider. In fact, as wide as the faculty of architecture was wide. In fact, this was the playing ground, per se, for notions for working out this concept of participation in a much wider field. And this asked, of course, a much wider and better theory than we had on that very moment. The notion on itself was still clear because it was very clear that everyone who was involved had to have control about his own part of the process. And you had to visualize that, and you had to make it physical so that really to do that. And you had to provide them with the methods and with the techniques to really involve them in the process in an open way. So in 1985, we had the International Design Participation Conference, and this was completely directed. It's not something on the developer, of course, maybe part of that, but it was a conference for all people involved in processes of housing, which was a real eye-opener. So, and that was also a possibility to reach a more international level than we had up till that very moment.
The title was Who is Participating?
Yeah?
The title was Who is Participating?
Yeah, that of course that was a notion, and because we had the idea that only developers were participating, and John was very against it because it was clear that when you put the question in that way, you made clear that the architect was the boss, and that his notion of participation, in fact, was patronizing. You were seeing them more or less as children, another type of children than Palladio children, which was an interesting book about how architects are working in the eyes of John.
So it was also then the breaking of the hierarchy of the architects in relation to the dweller.
Both of them have their function. Of course, the architect is very much involved in the design process, but he has to act as a host. That is what John writes in his books, Palladio Children. So he has another idea about how to deal with all these participating people in the field. In fact, he has to design the basic conditions for that. And that was quite a problem because architects always had the idea that when you had to design supports, that something was taken from them. They had a more poor idea of design, but in fact, the idea was that they had to go to the very essence of the building process and the very essence of the building to open it up to other people who could be involved in that. In fact, it is more or less tragic that that notion was not understood. And that was effective. That was quite an opening. And you asked Frans the question, how were we dealing on an international way in the time? And the international aspects are more or less involved, more interested in the higher scales, the higher urban scales. The higher levels is how do we deal with that? We in the Netherlands, we have quite a tradition that we did know how to connect the urban level with the physical architectural level. That was the Dutch tradition. Other people, not living in the Netherlands but outside, see still that that's the way how we are dealing with in the field of housing.
And that's for the future very important.
And that's really
The higher levels.
Yeah. Dus dus in the international projects, I think John worked in Japan, and open building is an international activity. We worked in Egypt, in New Maria City, and I did some projects in Macau. With Cesar Vieira and Fernando Taubra. That was quite interesting thing. And another level, also international, was in the field of education. Because it was clear that architects in Europe must have the possibility to work in all the countries, that they had to have an idea of education which would make it possible for them to work together, to collaborate. And in Brussels, in fact, this same faculty became more or less a model because it had this wide field involving also the technological aspect. And in Italy, even, they started a new type of education, of the engineering agency, the Brunellesco schools, as they called it in that time, just because they tried to involve the technical aspects in the wide sense of the word in the notion of architecture. And this, yeah, these things were more or less related with the items of SAR.
More questions? Several?
But we can ask upstairs in the room.
Okay. Are we okay on time or?
Thank you. Yeah?
One thing I want to say, and it's not as a criticism, but I think that there's a great need to develop the SAR ideas of urban tissue. Infill level, you have the support level, and then you have the urban tissue level. The supports are infill on the urban tissue levels, where the structure is the structure of outdoor spaces, urban spaces. And the notion of that is not known already, I discovered. There is very few examples